Hey everyone, welcome back to Be Not Afraid. Today, my guest is Katie. She recently graduated in mental health. You can follow her on Twitter at The Kids Are Not All Right. And I think that's an excellent opening for what we're going to talk about from just the very, very beginning. So, welcome so much, Katie.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me.
So, let's just jump in. I like to be kind of efficient as possible with giving information to parents and those people who will listen. I know that you recently graduated in mental health, but before that, you had a kind of an interesting past before that with cybersecurity. Is that correct?
So, not cybersecurity,
Okay.
Homeland Security.
Homeland
And
security.
this is, yeah, so my undergraduate degree is in Homeland Security from Tulane. And then I also got a master's degree from the University of Arizona in International Security. That was like right before I kind of switched and decided that I thought like maybe mental health would be a good route for me.
Okay.
And that's when I started at NYU and kind of just discovered all of this woke stuff. And it just kind of led me down this path that I'm on now. But yeah, so it is a little bit different.
Okay, so you use the term woke stuff, and I want to just be super clear from what I've seen in some of your other interviews. You're not religious, so you're not coming at the term woke from a religious perspective,
No, no, yeah. I mean, I'm not religious, and that's correct.
right? So where did you come to the idea that the kids are not all right?
Yeah, so basically, and just kind of like zooming back to maybe around 2020 is when I really started to wake up and kind of figure out what was going on. So I was in my master's degree for counseling and mental health and wellness. And I just kind of picked up on all of these like little oddities, people saying like little things, little racist things, things against law enforcement. It would just happen every so often. And then I started noticing that the professors were doing it. Then I started noticing it in the curriculum. And all of a sudden I realized like, okay, I think I might be like in a cult situation here. And I kind of got to like orient myself and figure out what's going on. So that led me to New Discourses, which is a really useful resource. If people aren't aware of it, it's newdiscourses.com or James Lindsay. Um, that got me kind of following into what was going on in critical social justice and things like that. Through that, that's how I learned about the Marxist educator Paulo Freire. I'm not sure how familiar you are with him, but his influence at this point, I mean, is really difficult to overstate. Um, Once all that clicked, and I kind of saw this big picture of en masse, basically radicalization of children that's been going on for decades. Seeing it in counseling with people who are mentally ill and children also. It really just kind of like hit me all at once, and pretty much everything. I mean, like my entire life, not my entire life, but so much of my life now has been devoted to this because there's just no going back from kind of seeing the level of harm that's going on.
Right. It's like once you know, there's no way people will say, how do you keep going? And there's no option. There
Mhm.
is no other option when you understand. Can we go into Paulo Freire? I learned about him only briefly because a teacher was telling me I needed to read his book to understand my level of oppression.
Oh,
And,
wow.
and I thought that was quite amusing. So,
Yeah, so like just as a really brief background, Paulo Freire is well, he was a Marxist educator from Recife, Brazil, who basically took what was a popular like hermeneutical method from like a radical Catholic workers movement and adopted it into like a literacy program. So it was a way of kind of simultaneously raising like literal literacy, like being able to read words, to also being able to like quote unquote read your political situation. So like you said, like being able to identify that you're oppressed in XYZ kinds of contexts. So it has this like dual like meaning of literacy going on there. Um, Over time, this is kind of adopted into the American. Oh, sorry, go
oh,
ahead.
I'm sorry. So a basic example for parents to understand would be instead of James Lindsay has a good one about going to the carnival,
I'm
right?
trying.
And,
Yeah.
and some children are not able to go to the carnival. Why are they not allowed to go to the carnival? Maybe they're not allowed to go to the carnival because their parents can't afford it. Maybe they're not allowed to go to the carnival because uh, it's like religious reasons, parents are going to shelter them kind of thing.
Hmm. Yeah, and like you bring up a really important point, which is that like this can basically be embedded into anything. Like this, and this is more of a pedagogical method than it is something that's like like necessarily curricular. So, I mean, gym class, math, science, there's basically nothing where you can't kind of springboard some, contextual discussion into this conscientization, which, I think like this is why I'm very careful, or I try not to use the word indoctrination because it's not even necessarily like a specific doctrine. It's more of like an attitude and a practice. So
Right.
instead of like asserting something that they want, it's more about identifying that's bad, not that bad, and kind of tearing it down through activism, versus like having an affirmative doctrine. I think they would think that like saying something affirmative would be like a little bit fascist or like imposing. So they can only really say what they don't want.
Which is interesting because we have affirmative care for kids. And
Yeah.
that is definitely pushing one ideology on our kids.
Yeah, and that's a fair point. And it's certainly, and this is like I think like where counseling specifically and like my field really, that's like I mean, the kids are all right. There are just so many different ways where the kids are not all right. And one of them is absolutely is in this, what people might call trans ideology. I'm not sure. I think actually I saw a video where you went through the queering of the American child. It's a very, very good book.
Mm-hmm. Yes. Yeah. We did a book, we did a book club on it for the summer. We just went through, yeah, chapter after chapter because people don't understand. And a lot of times I think that's intentional. Like you can tell that you have a master's degree. Your language is very, very professional, right? And but in terms of when I'm talking to parents and just trying to make it as simple as possible, not because parents are stupid, because that's not the case. I think what it is more of a intentional trust the experts. We know we use all of these big words you couldn't possibly understand. So how what I try to do is make it as simple as possible for people to
Mhm.
understand and they still feel very overwhelmed by it, I think.
Hmm. Yeah, and I think that's a really important thing. People just simply don't have like the time. And a lot of this stuff is, I mean, I think it's intentionally hidden behind, a certain like quote unquote level of language so they can
Right.
make people feel like they're lesser than. And when a mom comes to a school board meeting and just kind of says it like it is and doesn't put it in this like, um specialized language, if you will, it's kind of a way of, looking down upon people and dismissing their concerns.
Yes. And in fact, I was watching one of your interviews with the Radical Center, and you were talking about how there is an intentional of putting down other people. As specifically, you were talking about conservatives and Trump supporter people, but there's this. I think it's much more than that because that same thing can be used against race. I see it a lot of times. If you're white, you don't have a right to talk. We've been through so much, blah blah blah, and just it seems like we're intentionally teaching people to hate each other.
Hmm. It's, I mean, 100% a conflict oriented way of thinking and like practicing. I mean, I think like when it comes down to it, it's specifically designed to inflame various tensions, whatever those tensions can be. So if race is useful, that. If heteronormativity is useful, then that. And just sort of like, I mean, like tears apart the fabric of America. Whereas, previously it's just I identify as an American, my sex, my race, my, all of these other things are not like my primary identity in comparison to, a more like patriotic perspective that's cohesive, like a community, local, state, and national.
Yeah. Um, so you said that you realized pretty quickly that that it felt very cult-like.
Hmm.
So how did that happen for you? Like, did you come into school being social justice minded to start with? Or
Um, I mean, I wouldn't necessarily say yes now that I like kind of have like, I think like in like a vague, like I didn't really understand what that word even meant kind of way. So sort of like like a neutral Democrat or, like basically like that.
right.
Um, but like it never would have occurred to me. So like the more radical stuff, the racial identity, things that we would normally associate with woke, like that wasn't really on my radar at all. Like I truly, prior to going to grad school, like I really didn't think that it was real. I thought it was kind of like an online thing. And then it's just like, being around it. And of course it's weird too, because like you're with people and everyone seems normal and nice. And then they just like say these weird things. And like it's very destabilizing because you're trying to kind of figure out like what is going on here. Um, so like I'm sure I don't really watch like horror or like
Right.
thriller movies, but I'm sure there's some kind of like psychological thriller movie that like accurately kind of describes that sort of like weird Twilight Zone feeling of seeing these things, but everything kind of seems normal. And then you just kind of like realize like, wow, there's like a completely different perspective here that looks down upon a lot of people and is like completely detached from reality. And no one even seems to realize it, like it's entirely normal.
And you started this in 2020, is that correct?
Yeah, so my first semester would have been fall 2019. So yeah.
Okay, so right as COVID, right as everything. So one thing that I realized as a parent was that none of this was here, and then all of a sudden it was. And it really happened with George Floyd in 2020. So, like one day we're normal, everybody likes each other, and the next day it's if you're not in this group, we hate you. Is that what it was like in school too? Did you start off in 2019 having kind of a normal year and then all of a sudden, boom? Or were you
Um,
already doing critical theory before it?
So I'd say critical theory was certainly like already kind of de facto normal in my program. But George Floyd, that I mean that day specifically, I mean I had a class I think around that time, and we had to stay for like 3 or 4 hours. We had to do like a struggle session where everyone cried, like So there was definitely like it definitely marked a turning point for a lot of people. And I noticed a lot of I guess you could say like groveling or like really like trying to signal to the group that like I'm, this isn't okay. I'm grieving over this. Things like that. So I definitely like a marked shift in that way. I think in counseling we're a little bit more like, like the feminine style of woke, if you will, where like it's not so like it's like not so directly conflict oriented. It's a little bit more like maybe indirect.
That's interesting because I work for an organization where our focus is motherhood. And I feel like there's this massive crisis between um, those who embrace motherhood and this feminist movement that really wants to destroy the role, demonize the role of motherhood. And meanwhile, by saying we're the experts, you should trust us. We know the best way to raise your kids. But I see so much of that raising of our kids as our kids really truly struggling with mental health, even if, and it does seem like there's like a power of suggestion to that. Like kids who would normally seem healthy, who don't really need, they just need to be told no. Sometimes it's just a fact. And suddenly they're lining up for mental health. And right now we're in our legislative session. And one of the things that we were dealing with was should parents be allowed to know what their kids are talking to counselors about in school? And all of these kids are writing out as a child who's suicidal and, give me a list of all of the other issues that I'm dealing with. And I'm just thinking, I always thought as somebody who's been trained to be a foster parent that the more a person talks about being suicidal, the less likely they are to actually do it. Is that wrong? Was I taught wrong in that?
Um, I mean, what I've been taught is that it's not bringing it up, for example, and like assessing for risk, it doesn't increase the risk, but I'm not sure about like necessarily the relationship between the two and like in terms of how much you talk about it.
Okay. So what I mean by that is that there are kids who will constantly say that they are, and they're not the ones who tend to be the ones who
I
actually
see.
carry through.
Yeah.
So in that way, I feel like I was reading one of your quotes the other day. Let me pull it up just a second. But it was, you put it in gray, so I'll pull it up in just a sec. Um, well, or maybe not. There was one where you're talking about the thing that you want to stress more than anything is the fact that our kids are being used as activists.
Yeah. Yeah.
And
So, oh, sorry, go ahead.
no, that's fine. But that's what I see in kids who will constantly talk about their mental health. And especially, this is going to get touchy for people, but especially the kids who are dealing with gender confusion. Like, if you don't support us, that causes violence, and thus we get to justify actual violence towards people.
Hmm. And I think one of like the cruelest tools that has been used in like the, the trans issue in terms of like getting parents on board is the suicide issue. So it's not uncommon for parents to be told, well, do you want a dead daughter or a living son, something along those lines, where it's framed as like this is literally life-saving care. If you don't do it, you're basically killing your child. Like that, like the way, I mean, I just can't even fathom like the position that parents, like what that feels like and the position that you're put in, because it's already an impossible situation to begin with. You're already like trying to deal with a lot. There's very few resources to kind of help you navigate that at the professional level. And this is what the so-called professionals are telling you. I think it's, I mean, truly, very cruel.
It's interesting that you said there's very few resources because it feels like there's almost a kit. Like as soon as you can get a child hooked on this, you're giving them Trevor space. You're giving them glisten. You're giving them these resources that don't seem. It seems to me like you slap expert on everything, but they're not actually proven best policies.
Hmm. And there's, I mean, so much, like political manipulation, if you will, or just, you know, the interest is in kind of facilitating this, even like at the expense of, real scientific rigor. So it makes it very difficult to be able to kind of trust. I'm thinking, for example, of the WPATH files. I think that's
Right.
what they're called. It's the scale of this issue is so beyond, like it's like truly heartbreaking. Like sometimes I can't, like when I like try to comprehend the scale of even just the the transitioning children issue. I mean, it's truly unbelievable.
How is it that they're well, first, I'd like to go back to a word you said. You said that it was like a struggle session. I know what a struggle session is, but I know that some listeners won't. So, can you explain that in terms of its cultural revolution ties?
Yeah, absolutely. So struggle sessions, I mean, they were heavily used in the Chinese Cultural Revolution as, like basically exploiting sense of collective identity, shame, things like that to, try to get people who, have quote unquote Black identities, counter-revolutionaries, like things that are not, whatever's not convenient for revolution, that would be your target. So it could change in different contexts. Um, in the case, so like my personal experience with struggle sessions primarily happens among women. So I think there's like a little bit of a different dynamic there, but I think it's also useful to talk about a little bit because I think a lot of moms are probably more likely to end up in these kinds of contexts. But it
Right.
usually comes like a little bit more indirectly, where it's like, I know you care about this. Like, I know you have a good heart, like kind of like trying to manipulate you into using your values against you, kind of like like playing it up a little bit, but like in kind of a mean girl way to get you on board with things that you're resisting, and then using like your natural tendency to um want to be connected with others, like we do have an in-group desire, like we don't want to be excluded, um and our national like natural compassion, things like that, to kind of exploit you into like stepping off the ground that you're on. And once you do that, and like once you're kind of like off the ground and in this circle, metaphorically or like literally, because sometimes this happens in things like restorative justice circles and things like that, it's very destabilizing and it's very hard to come back from. I think I would recommend I'm sure there's a New Discourses podcast. I don't know the name of it, but it's specifically about surviving a modern struggle session. I think that would be really
Mhm.
useful for people to, listen to.
And for anyone who doesn't understand what a struggle session is, in China, they would bring, when I just want to break it down as simply as possible. In China, they would bring people out who, for whatever reason, offended. Oftentimes, people would tell each other that they were, or they would tell on each other. So they also did this in Russia, even for something like, you have a nicer apartment than I do, so let me get you in trouble. And then they would have to go and stand outside and basically commit to lies, commit to mistruths, and because it didn't stop really unless they did. And they were physically abused. They would put bricks on their necks and they physically abused them. I honestly feel like the mental abuse and the fear of being canceled, of losing your job. I know people whose family have completely turned on them, like their own children, because they will not bow to the lie. But I think that bowing to a lie, whatever that lie is, um, I think it honestly, like, I think that's extremely abusive.
Mhm.
What kind of repercussions does that have on a person? And especially kids, because I want to talk to you about what they're doing with kids. So,
Yeah,
yeah.
absolutely. And it, like you said, it, like the core part of it is like accept like either admitting to lies that you didn't, or admitting to things that you didn't actually do, or like a framing that you don't actually accept, things like that. I mean, I
Mhm.
think psychologically, like the moment that happens, like you've immediately like split yourself a little bit, and like you've lost a little bit a part of your dignity. And like that's not a small thing.
Mhm.
Because once that happens, everything like this is kind of what I'm trying to I think like metaphorize, whatever you want to like call it, with the
Okay.
circle thing and like being on the ground. So like if you think about like you're on the ground in truth, the moment that you kind of give that up, you lose that grounding and everything becomes so much harder to kind of navigate. And you can almost not see out of this like circle of fear and being canceled and all these kinds of things. Um, once you take that step and you accept things that you didn't do, or accept, lies that aren't true, or framing that isn't true. And a lot of people will do it, I think, because it just seems like just get it over with, like easy to go along to get along, things like that. And there really is like, I mean, like a serious degradation of the soul, if you will. And when it comes to kids, like, I mean, that's a whole nother level because kids really want to be accepted. They don't really have necessarily the same, the amount of life experience to feel grounded in the truth and what they know. And a lot of times this is coming from authority figures. So if they've been, raised to trust teachers and, listen to their discipline and things like that for good reason, this could be like massively used against them, to where they're, kind of bowing to something that, an authority figure has pushed on them that is, abjectly abusive.
Where, first off, did you ever bow to it when you were in school? Were there times when you were just like, I'm just gonna get through this, put my head down and get through this?
Kind of. So like in like actual class struggle sessions, I just like kept my mouth shut, which is like something that I do regret. Now that I have like more ground, like more understanding what was going on, I think at the time I was just kind of observing and like confused, but
Mhm.
like I shouldn't have just sat there and like kind of just let it go on. I think there's also like a motivation for a lot of people, especially in those contexts where like it's just I just want this like stupid degree and like to be done and like move on with my career and like actually, do real work. But yeah, like I certainly, in order to get to the end of my program, like I absolutely had to play like a little bit of the game in terms of like, certain assignments. And like for example, in our cross-cultural counseling thing, our cross-cultural counseling class, we had to do like final projects, like a personal kind of intersectional biography kind of thing. I don't think that I fully understood like what I was supposed to be doing. I think I kind of like tried, but like even at that time, I didn't have a full understanding of what intersectionality and like all these things really wanted from me. Like I remember the first assignment, I got marked down because we had to list all of our like age, gender, all of our identity markers. And like in the like I should have just like said like none of your business, none of your business. Um, but like I did it, but I didn't put like each one being marginalized or oppressed or whatever. Like that didn't occur to me. Apparently, like everyone else knew and I just didn't. But so I put woman, but I didn't put like woman thus oppressed. And because I didn't do that, I actually lost points on that assignment, which is kind of funny. Um, but yeah, so there are certain ways. And I definitely, when I look back, I see the effect it was having on me mentally to like take all of this stuff and kind of go along to get along. Pardon. Um, like it's definitely not good for the soul. I mean, absolutely. And now that we kind of have a frame as to what is actually going on here, like we know that they're really nefarious end goals in terms of revolution. Um, like it just makes it worth whatever, like what you're going to lose is worth it because what you're giving up in order to, not be canceled or to maintain certain relationships. I mean, unfortunately, the reality is that like if people are willing to dump you over certain things, like maybe they weren't necessarily like the people that you wanted in your life anyway.
Right. Talk to me about that in terms of revolution, because I think a lot of people will think that that sounds crazy. Do they actually use that term when you're training, or is it something that you found later on new discourses?
Yeah, so I've never personally, I don't think, heard the term or seen it like revolution,
Okay.
um, like in specifically counseling. I mean, on occasion, like there are definitely like radical segments who are like a little bit more explicit about it.
Right.
But usually it's, liberation. That would be like more of the preferred term is like collective liberation. Um, which in this case, yeah, like it's just another word for revolution.
Right. Liberation comes from Black liberation or education and theology, right? Which was violent.
Yeah.
So, um, yeah, this month is February and I just taught Black history to my kids, but and I don't like it. Like I don't like the idea of teaching divisive history, especially because so many people use those liberatory people. So I do the back. I go backwards and I teach them about Thomas Sowell. I do the stuff that would make public school teachers cringe. But that's, you know, because it does seem like we're intentionally teaching people to pity each other, or for one group to pity and the other group to demand whatever reward they get without realizing that they are embracing the weakest part of history instead of, because they could be embracing the positive things. They could be embracing resilience. That's a word I'd love to talk to you about because we see it used, it's weaponized all the time. People are like, oh, SEL makes you more resilient. But the question is, resilient to what?
Mhm.
So I would love to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah, absolutely. So resilience is like 100% like a like a watchword that you want to be on the lookout for in like a variety of different contexts. Corey said, social emotional learning is absolutely like one of them. So when normal people think of resilience, obviously that's a good thing. And so they're kind of banking on the fact that like you're just going to take it at face value. Um,
Mhm.
9 times out of 10, especially in like woke context, or and especially like in children's like social emotional learning context, it means like resilience to take your brainwashing well. I mean, there's no other way of kind of putting that. Like it's, because it's not pleasant. Like these things that they're putting kids through aren't actually enjoyable to like most of the children are going to resist this a little bit. And so you kind of have to emotionally manage the resistance in a way to kind of keep it going. And so I mean, it's kind of a hard truth, but that's kind of what's going on there.
Do they think they're being kind? Do they think that this is just a softer way of changing the culture to brainwash children? Because I mean, that's what every dictator in history has thought, right? It's
Hmm.
the children, let us do it this way, then we don't need more drastic.
Hmm. Yeah, I think that a lot of people, and especially like I say this with like all due respect to the counselors, the teachers, like the people who like really true, like in their heart of hearts, like mean well, and they're just like not
Mhm.
really aware of kind of the dynamics of everything that's going on. And like a lot of people who are in it are also taking things at face value as well. So they see resilience, they think it's, like a like a regular way of thinking about that word, not like a specialist insider kind of way. And sincerely think that they're like creating kinder, more interdependent,
Empathetic.
cooperative, children. I mean, I truly think that that's what a lot of people think that they're doing. Um, I also think like this is where the cult dynamic comes in because like as that fails, because like obviously this is not like what's actually happening. So as you like see with your own two eyes that this is not working, that's where like the cult comes in and it's like, oh, everything's okay, like keep going, everything's great. Like it like mentally like shields people and like tries to keep them from listening to like their eyes and their ears and their instincts.
Right. Um, sorry, I got an alert. So on a level of like one through 10, in terms of abuse that we're putting our children through SEL specifically, where are we? How abusive would you call this?
Um, that's a difficult one. I mean, because I think it's so like like I can't say this word,
Yeah,
insidious.
insidious, I think. Yes.
Um, it like definitely like somewhere in the like if 10 is like, really hardcore like physical abuse, like probably somewhere in the middle. When it comes to like psychological abuse, I'd probably put it a little bit higher. I mean, it's really
Yeah.
like especially because like things like SEL, and this kind of relates actually to the school safety thing. If you'd like, I can talk a little bit
Yes,
about that.
absolutely.
But like social emotional learning is usually tied up with things like multi-tiered systems of support, MTSS, which is kind of like a way of mass testing or like mass screening children. So everyone
Competency, correct?
yeah, so everyone kind of gets like a wide net cast. So there's not like a single kid that's left out of this kind of agenda. And then you also have things like character education, social emotional learning. Those are also like built into the curriculum. So this is like an en masse, like everyone is being exposed to this and everyone is having data being collected on them. Um, so like in that context, school safety is usually like positioned in this sort of like matrix of um brainwashing, to put it bluntly,
Right.
and surveillance. So, you have all of this data. I mean, I'm not a lawyer, but all of this, like collecting data on children, strikes me as like a massive constitutional violation of privacy. Um, so taking this information, it also kind of allows and like I say this like I'm kind of like breaking it down in a way that's blunt, but like I want to emphasize that I don't think that this is like a conscious thing that's going on with the people that are doing it. But like that data gives them information as to what's relevant to the kids, and those specific issues can then be used to brainwash them further. So they'll know that, this segment of kids is really concerned with the environment. And so they're like, oh, this is relevant for the kids. Let's do our brainwashing in this way. And so it's like, no, I don't think like that's, the way that people are necessarily thinking, but that's like literally what's happening.
That's individualized learning.
Hmm.
Where you're learning on your Chromebook and it's adjusting to you, it literally is adjusting to you in making you more conscious, critical consciousness, right?
Hmm. Yeah, which is it's just awful.
Wow.
Um, and like related to the school safety, I think people forget, and I don't expect people to necessarily know this, but schools are considered part of critical infrastructure, like in terms of, like DHS
Hmm.
organization and things like that. And as far as I can tell, and this is something that I'm going to say with a grain of salt, and I would need to like fact check myself on, but like looking at this document and some of the other things that I've seen, it looks like all of these reporting hotlines, so like basically snitch lines,
Yes.
are going to like fusion centers, like post 9/11 intelligence fusion centers. So, I mean, it paints a picture where like little Timmy is, you know, telling on a friend over like some, quote unquote racist comment or something like that. It's getting reported into a system that's connected with like into like 9/11 or post 9/11 fusion centers. Like what is going on? It's a level of constitutional violation, I think, probably, and also just like flat out abuse and surveillance on children that is like so mind blowing to me.
I want to. I want to hit what that is. So that's the SAFE app. So sometimes it's Safe Arizona, sometimes it's Safe Utah, Safe Portland, or Safe Oregon. Um, and they brought that in with this idea that we have too many kids that are suicidal. And so because of that, they felt that that's how it was brought in. That's how it was portrayed to elected officials who are going to vote for it. But I do think that behind closed doors, they already had the infrastructure to do what they are doing, which is very Soviet in that it is teaching children to be comfortable reporting on their neighbor. And it actually talks about that. It actually says making reporting comfortable.
Yeah,
So
insane. I saw a
it
thing. I
was
wish
yeah.
I'm
What were you
sorry.
gonna
I
say?
was
Go
just gonna
ahead.
say, I wish I had the document because I'm pretty sure that like one of the things was like the noting like what makes people more likely to report, and one of them was that they're younger. So like I'm thinking like, wow, like you're really like going for the kindergartners, aren't you?
Yes.
It's sick, really.
The same thing with safe and welcoming. Safe and welcoming is coded word for LGBTQIA plus support in schools, which is just another term. It's a soft. I do not believe that a state like mine, Utah, is going to quickly put in comprehensive sex ed. They're going to spread the guide rails a little bit further so that a little bit of it can come in.
Mhm.
And now, why? Why do we care about the sexuality of young children?
Yeah. I mean, I can guess.
Okay.
I mean,
Yeah.
it's certainly like the way that they like say like a revolutionary like a communist for example would see like the concept of childhood innocence, that kind of interferes with having this more awakened consciousness of reality, like they're all about kind of de-ideologizing reality, and like one of these little things that they would consider to be a little bit of a fantasy is childhood innocence. So that like getting rid of the childhood innocence opens them up more to like being more radical communists and things like that. And like there's definitely a precedent, like for example, in early, I guess, 20th century Hungary, Georgy Lukács, I think you could call it, an original G word, if you will, in terms of like having these communist things related specifically to like early childhood sexuality.
Right. And it stopped because parents were having none of it.
Yeah.
Like it started and they were just like, nope. Immediately they stopped. What is our crisis of courage that is making people not even stand up for their own kids?
I mean, I think it's like it's I think like a form of intellectual courage in the sense of like being able to look at what's happening and like accept that it really is, So like your like mind is going to say like, no, they don't really mean that. That's not really happening. Like making up all these excuses for like the level of severity of the situation and like what's happening, especially with children. And so being able to kind of like look the monster in the eye, if you will. Like it takes a lot of courage. Like it really does, because nobody wants to kind of face the reality that like children are literally being like activated, like radicalized en masse in multiple different ways, not the least of which includes like young children's sexuality.
Right.
It's a level of horror that becomes very difficult to kind of like face down. And so like your mind is going to want to say like, no, no, that's not really happening. So kind of overcoming that and just getting involved in local communities, kind of like maybe seeing what's going on in your local school district. I mean, obviously, I assume most of the people that are watching this are probably Utah based and are probably already kind of doing that. But it's like getting over that hump, I think, and just looking it in the face and realizing like you actually like we have to actually do something about this because it's that big of an issue. I think that's where, the crisis of confidence or the crisis of courage really is.
Yeah, it's heartbreaking to me to watch so many people who are in charge of protecting our children just step back and willingly say it's not happening. It would never happen. And it's just like, but it is. It's right here. How rampant is it, like across the United States?
I mean, I would say it's pretty much total. I mean, I don't want to say like every single school, but the way that it kind of comes top down, like things pushed from the United Nations into the Department of Education, which is then pushed into the state departments of education, which is then pushed into the schools, the schools of education where all the teachers are being trained. Like all of these things kind of coming together, it's a pretty total picture. And I think like it extends beyond just public schools too. Like there's, issues in private schools, issues in parochial, like Christian
Mhm.
religious
Mhm.
schools. It's not the breadth of it is really quite significant.
Um, can I go back to when you were in school? What was okay, so you said that you had that first assignment. At what point did you realize I'm in a boiling pot? Like the frog in the boiling pot.
Um, I mean, I think the George Floyd thing, like what I mentioned before, that was like a big one for me because it was just so weird. And um, I think just like the more time went on. So like somewhere between like 2020 and 2022, when I was simultaneously like in this kind of, I mean, honestly, like cult environment, even if like most of it was distance and things like that. Like we did meet for live classes and stuff on Zoom, things like that.
Mhm.
Um, but so that plus like doing the research and kind of figuring out what's going on a more historical, intellectual, whatever you want to call it level, like that combination is when I like realized like, okay, like this is like heading towards Jonestown, like there's like a moment where it just like clicks and you're like this, like if we don't start changing things or like wake up and like realize like we're not heading somewhere good, like we're gonna ruin our profession. We're gonna take a whole bunch of innocent people down with us.
Right.
Um, we're going to lose our country. Like all of these things are really, I mean, so significant. So once you kind of realize that, I mean, like we kind of talked about earlier, there's just no going back. I mean, once I realized that like we were truly in an actual communist revolution, um, like almost my whole life has been dedicated to learning about it, trying to tell other people about it, like doing whatever I can, even in small ways, because it's just, I mean, so incredibly important.
Right. Can you talk to me about this one is always hard for me because it blows my mind the target of the racial kind of revolution. So if a person like me goes into therapy, and I know I'm very pale with my lighting, but if a person like me goes into therapy because, I need to talk to a therapist for whatever reason, maybe I'm tired of the Cultural Revolution and I just need somebody to talk to, right? Um, but it's always pushed towards what is the word, broaching, um, or how you guys were literally trained that it has to be turned into about my race, correct?
Yeah, so yeah, it's honestly insane, but like this is actually like a fundamental core competency of professional counseling since at least 2016 is it's considered under social justice and multicultural counseling competencies, but it's literally raising critical consciousness. They use that exact language, including learning or unlearning about privilege and oppression. So yeah, like if you were to come into my office and like I personally would not do this, but like say I were someone else who was, just kind of following the training, not really understanding what I was doing, or like maybe a more radical person who knows exactly what I'm doing. I might suggest, as a part of whatever issue you might have, that it could be related to your experience of oppression. And maybe try to like psychoeducate you on your experience of oppression and what these dynamics are. Maybe try to like point out these things. And from the perspective of a vulnerable person who, for like good reason, is presumably trusting the professional that's, guiding them, they can get taken for a ride, into like a completely different realm. Yeah, that's like sees especially race. And I think like in the United States, and especially like after, things like George Floyd, like we're super primed to be like really focusing on the race issue. And we do have like a real, a real history that we have to reckon with.
Mhm.
And that reckoning is getting like mixed up and um taken advantage of or like used to forward um like a racial consciousness that's like designed to like break us apart and cause conflict.
Right. That racial consciousness is two things. One, to teach us why we're oppressed, and two, how to dismantle all systems. So basically, to go to a therapist today, not in all cases, because there are great therapists who are like, who see it and are committed to the real work of a therapist. But basically, when we go to therapy, um, if someone's following this kind of method, we will come out being more activist minded.
Yeah, and that's considered like a primary goal in that like it's perceived as necessary for like your mental health. So like your mental health and well-being, if you don't have this critical consciousness and accompanying, activism and resistance, then like you're not actually well. Like really you're just like a colonized kind of like fake well. Like that's how they would frame it.
Oh,
Um,
okay.
so yeah, like they like truly believe that like going to like be a participant in the revolution. So functionally like being thrown in like cannon fodder into the revolution. That like people who do that are saving themselves, that are like are literally like in a religious sense, like salvific, kind of saving. And so that's what's being done to a lot of like vulnerable people who there's basically nothing that you can't turn into conscientization, because it could be race, it could be gender, it could be anything.
Can you
Um,
break that word down for like a first grader?
yeah,
Conceit.
I'm sorry.
That's okay.
So that's like referring back to Pellephrey and the critical
Yes.
consciousness thing. So being like conscientization is the process. So let's call it a brainwashing process. But to be conscientized would be like after you've been inducted into this woke cult and like you have this woke consciousness. So it's being aware of these systems of oppression and power. So, like we were talking about earlier, like trying to help you see that maybe because you're, black, this, and that kind of thing, or because you're a woman. It's also raising the agency, like a sense of agency to do something about it. So it's kind of building, that you have power, like you can go do something about it. You're not just a victim. And this is where like it kind of gets a little bit mixed because in a lot of circumstances, like it's presented as like victimizing or like, people are the victims of their circumstances and stuff like that. But like when it comes down to it, people want a sense of agency. So it's very easy to kind of build that. So it's the awareness, the agency, and the action. That's why it's like really important to understand is the action is built into this kind of woke worldview. So somebody who's quote conscientized would be somebody who is fully like in the woke cult and is doing the activism and all that kind of stuff. But like the activism is part of the worldview. Like it's never just theory. That's why it's kind of confusing. So
That's the praxis.
yeah, exactly.
Okay.
And it's just this constant cycle. So somebody who is in the woke cult will tear things down, activism, whatever,
Right.
and whatever comes out in the rubble, that is now the problem. And then you do it over again and over again. So it's just like so it's really um I mean it's like a spiral basically like into hell is kind of like how I picture it. Yeah.
Perfect. Perfect. I was going to say it just makes a person miserable. And the
Yeah.
crazy thing is, I think a lot of people are tired of the race conversation, and I do understand that. But take homosexuality. Okay, there are many gay and lesbian couples that are just like great. We're allowed to love each other, to live our home, to have normal lives, and they are considered not part of the group. They're just as ostracized because it wasn't just about allowing people to live their lives the way they choose. It has to be about activism.
Hmm.
And
Yeah.
now we're taking that from the adults and we're putting it into our youngest children. So, one of the things that I've seen, and people say, oh, this is so cute, is a protest, have kindergartners protest to get milk of their choice. So, protest to get chocolate milk. And isn't it so cute? They're walking down the hallways and when you explain that, people look at you like, oh, you're a radical extremist. Can't you just appreciate the cuteness of it? And I'm like, well, no, because I understand where it heads from here,
Mhm. Yeah,
which
and it's
is
not oh,
go ahead.
sorry, go
No, go
ahead.
ahead. You no.
That it's not a benign thing to like what should be an opportunity for kids to learn, because there are things that they actually do need to learn. And that's being replaced with like, learning to be an activist and being angry and like, thinking about your gender and your sexuality and like all these different kinds of things. That's taking up all of this other important time too.
Right.
And yeah, like it like part of me thinks like especially with like this is a huge thing because like for example if you look at like documents for like from the UN talking about various like radicalization strategies, it's always like cute kids, so it is like a thing, I guess you could say, like a way of kind of hiding it a little bit because of course people are going to see kids like with their little picket signs and think that it's cute and like not really process like what is actually happening there. They're literally being trained to be activists.
Right. Right. It's abusive. The other people who I think are the most abused are the Caucasian males. Did you guys learn anything that was anti them in school?
Um, yeah, if there's like one thing that was totally above board in every sense was attacking white men. I mean, that was like completely normalized. And part of it too is like we didn't really have, it was mostly women. It was a fair amount of women of color, but like it was primarily like when it comes to demographics, it was women. And so white men are like the biggest, anti thing in like the kind of woke perspective even to the people I'd say who are like maybe on the more mild end of woke, who maybe like aren't fully in the cult, like it's still pretty normalized to kind of be like, white men, like that kind of thing. So yeah, like things like the diagnostic statistical, like the DSM, which is what we
Mhm,
use for
mhm,
diagnoses,
mhm.
because that was written like, written in the sense of like, studied and a lot of rigorous things going into it. But because that was done primarily by white men, like that in itself is a reason for a lot of people to dismiss it.
Right.
Um, or other work in counseling and psychology. That was done by a white man, so toss aside. That was like completely normal.
Do you think that that has a correlation to the fact that the majority, maybe I shouldn't say the fact, but from what I see, the majority of people who carry through with suicide tend to be white males?
I mean, I certainly think it could be a factor. Yeah. I really, it is by far the most ostracized, like forgotten about kind of demographic of people. So I can certainly see why that experience, especially like as it relates to things like getting jobs, um, because there are like real tangible things when like DEI when it's implemented and, in the
Mhm.
context of job, like there are real tangible, victims of these things. So yeah, I mean, I certainly think that there could be a relationship. Yeah.
She just brought up DEI. I've got some people who I in just some of my parenting groups, there will be somebody who will come in and they'll be like, I don't see what the problem is with DEI. It's just teaching us to be kind and open-minded. Will you? You can tell by my voice the way I feel about this.
Yeah, I've definitely heard that refrain before.
Right.
Yeah, which is unfortunate because that like it's sold in that way. Like it is flat out like a direct import from, I mean, from like Stalinist policy. Like it's like that level of seriousness.
Yeah.
And it's just marketed to, maybe like a certain demographic, like your moderate liberal, that kind of thing, as just being kind. But no, like there like are real tangible like things going on, in terms of like excluding certain groups from positions of power. So, that includes like universities. And for a lot of jobs, you have to go to school in order to get that job. So it excludes people from those jobs. Um, it also like when it comes to like knowledge and things like that. So, um, like all of the things that have built everything that we love about the modern world in the United States, primarily because of merit and being grounded in reality, things like that. So, science, like real hard, like not hard, but real science, not like pseudoscience, touchy-feely kind of thing. Um, so having to kind of include BS basically as a means of excluding these like real, kinds of merit and stuff like that. Like that has real tangible impacts in the world. When you reject merit, like things start falling apart because we actually are a society, like all the good things in society are built on merit.
Right. Um, so mental health in schools, is that just a bad idea? So when I ran for office, I talked a lot about school counselors, and people would say, "What's wrong with a school counselor? All they're doing is teaching you how to get, how to get your grades in order, what to plan for college." And that changed, I believe, 10 years ago with Michelle Obama calling for school therapists, school counselors to become change makers. Um, what does that term mean?
So it's another word basically for activism or being an activist. So it's, being an activist in your school and making other people be little activists, including the children. Yeah, in terms of like school counseling and, its relevance, I mean, like the guidance counseling aspect of it, like I certainly think that's good. I don't have a problem with that. And like one of the things that I think gets kind of mixed in is almost like a judgment against guidance counseling. Like there, like if you say that school counselors should like stick to guidance counseling, it's perceived as an insult, as though like doing that is like a lesser, position. It's just different. Like I do clinical mental health, and that's just different than guidance counseling, but there's nothing wrong with doing that.
Right,
But like it's a completely different kind of thing. And as far as I understand, school counselors are not necessarily trained in, mental health interventions and things like that. And so, maybe aren't um like appropriately trained to even be doing actual therapy with kids. And then, like you said earlier, the added issue of, parental consent, being able to know things about what's going on.
yep,
I mean, I have no idea the number, but it's not insignificant the number of kids who have been transitioned at school behind their parents' back with the help of a school counselor.
right. We even have therapy clubs where kids are providing therapy for each other.
Oh my gosh. Wow.
Yep. And it's praised as this wonderful idea.
Wow. Do they
I
have
think
like
it,
specific like orientations or like topics and stuff like that?
um, my guess that it is that it's going to be towards kind of the Rainbow Coalition type stuff.
Yeah. Wow.
Um, the same thing when I talk about DEI, I always call it division, exclusion, and ideology.
That's a good way of doing it.
That's really what I see, because I was recently told about a young high school kid who's quirky, a little odd, and he was part of the inclusive club and kicked out for not being queer. So, can you define? I know what it is, but I would prefer a professional to talk about what does queer mean.
Yeah, so and this is a really good thing to bring up because I think a lot of people when they hear the word queer, they think like specifically sexuality, kind of like the
Mhm.
old school definition where like being queer was equivalent to being gay, but that's
Mhm.
not actually what it means. So like now when you hear the word queer, what you should be hearing is like a political orientation. So queer is basically like position to whatever is normal. So, when you have these oppressed oppressor matrix of, like various different kinds of things. In this oppressed oppressor matrix, the oppressor is normality, like literally just being normal. And the oppressed is queer. So queer is basically like whatever is in opposition to what is normal. So it's kind of like I mean, it's like true, like revolutionary in like the truest sense of the world and like it word and like a revolt kind of sense. And it does not mean like, gender or sexuality. Like that's really important. That's also why like when, Carrie was talking about earlier, or excuse me, um, if you're like gay or lesbian, but you're not like on board, the LGBTQ plus train, like you're not welcome, like you're not good enough, that kind of thing.
Yeah, when I think of it, I think of it as a stick. And if you take a stick and you twist it to a point that it's unrecognizable as a stick, that's what we're kind of doing to our children's minds, is we're
Mm.
twisting truth out of their minds so that there is no such thing as true. I think another thing to remember is that what's normal today won't be normal tomorrow. So if we say the traditional family is what's normal, and then we remove that because it's just too terrible to fathom the traditional family. And so then we say, I mean, I've seen them. I've seen those wheels of privilege and power, right? And it literally goes down to you are privileged if you have a house that has 2 stories. You are privileged if you have one car. Okay, so we get rid of the people who have more than one car. You get rid of the people who have more than one car. Who knows what get rid of means? But you get rid of the people who have more than one car. Then you're looking at the people who have a single car. And that's why I think that it is extremely relevant to talk about a cultural revolution, because that's what happens is that people, once that seed of resentment begins to grow, there's no pruning it. There's no, oh, I'm good at this point. Once you have that queer revolutionary energy mindset, there's never a stopping of it,
Hmm.
which is just so miserable to hand to our babies.
Hmm.
How many people do you think that are like teachers, counselors, administrators? How many people know what they're actually doing versus they're just given one little piece of the puzzle?
Um, Maybe, I mean, no more than a third, probably actually like are real radicals where they know what they're doing. I'd say it depends on like what level. So if you're talking about your local school, maybe a third, I don't know, maybe less even. But once you kind of go up, higher and higher into like academia and, various think tanks and like political organizations and things like that, that's where I think the proportion will probably get a little bit higher. But it is quite concerning, I think, that so many educators and counselors um, have like a relatively surface level understanding of the things that they're participating in, that a lot of things are hidden behind academic language. So, like, I have a master's degree. A lot of people have master's degrees, and they'll think, like, okay, well, I have a master's degree, so I know all of this stuff really well. But, like, clearly that's not true because we're like missing a huge chunk of the core of it, or like the actual purpose, the reality of it. So it creates this dynamic where people maybe think that they have more knowledge than they like truly do. Um, and are like less inclined maybe to like look into it a little bit more, or like kind of just assume like I would have been taught this in my master's program if I needed to, or if it were relevant. So I have all of the information already. Um, but yeah, I'd say like at least a third maybe would know what they're doing. I think like also the biggest problem is that you cannot know at all what you're doing, but like you have this like mindset. So you have this like, the queer negative revolutionary mindset, and you're doing the action and you have like absolutely no awareness as to, the purpose of any of it. So that would be like a higher percentage, I would, estimate.
That's like Animal Farm. And I don't mean it rudely, but it's the useful idiot, right? I
Hmm.
mean, where you really don't know. But there is this kind of elitism that seems like it's almost taught, because I can't imagine some people looking at others. It's hard for me to fathom like actually being conscious of the fact you think you're better than other people. I know that there are moments when I'm like, oh, I'm grateful that's not my life, but that's not the same as literally thinking there are people that you should just not listen to, that they're irrelevant because they're not quote unquote as smart as you. You seem quite young. I hope that's not offensive, but you
No.
seem like so, because what I'm wondering about is with young people, do you guys embrace it more? Do you know what you're facing? I was talking to someone, I don't want to say who, but I was talking to someone, a younger person, and they were like, you know what? I was never taught about Marx in school. I don't know what you're talking about because I was never taught about Karl Marx. I never heard about him. I'm like, that's fine. Just because you haven't heard his name doesn't mean you haven't learned his practices. because the
Mhm.
same person is like, we shouldn't have to work. Work is slavery. And I'm like, oh, but you have.
Yeah, I mean, like I think I'm on the border of millennial and Gen Z, so like
Okay.
in that range.
Yeah.
And I certainly like once I kind of woke up to what was going on, I had to take like a huge stock of looking back on my life. And I went to public school up until I eventually went to boarding school for high school. But like I was in public school for a lot, and even like boarding school too. There was a lot of woke stuff there. You're really immersed in it. It's almost like the water that you swim in or the air that you breathe, and as of course, a part of the Cultural Revolution. So I really had to take stock of all of these things that I sort of like took for granted. Um, and yeah, I certainly think like my generation, and especially like the generation below me, like Gen Z, I mean, it's pretty much a nonstop. I'm in terms of like the brainwashing, if you will, that's coming from different levels. So you have the schools. A lot of times, if you go to a therapist, you have the therapist. You have social media, so they're getting inundated with it in social media. You
You
have
have the
traditional media.
churches,
Yeah, the churches. So it's around them so much that I can understand why it's difficult for them to even see that like it's happening. Which is really scary. I truly worry a lot about Gen Z specifically. I think maybe there's like a little bit of a shift for the next one. I think it's Gen Alpha or something like
hmm
that. Like Gen Z like really had it rough in terms of like all of these different things, and they're kind of primed to be really angry
hmm
and like resentful towards like boomers, the system, like all these different kinds of things. So
and
that
if
definitely,
not angry, apathetic. Those, so that's
yeah,
the other side. It's really sad. Yeah.
yeah, it is really sad. And I personally, when it comes to counseling, like I like maybe the college aged kind of thing, or even I don't have much experience in it, but like even like the older teens, that kind of thing.
Right.
Because not only do I think like, yeah, they've had it rough and it is hard on them. But yeah, they're like in this really a lot of them do struggle with things like depression and apathy. Because all of this stuff does feel like very overwhelming to them.
Mm-hmm. That's what I see having a student who's still in high school. I mean, people will say it's so impressive that he can look people in the eyes. And that is just, it kills your heart that that's noticeable at this age. But I think they're targeting the middle school. So they're the ones that can still be a lot of the high schoolers. They're like, you took so much from us, and they're not buying it. I would say a lot of them are red pilled, for good or for bad, because you can be extreme regardless of where you stand, right?
Hmm.
So, but I think that a lot of them are just like, you know what, it's all a bunch of baloney. And maybe they're angry, but they're angry in a way that they will say exactly what they think. And I kind of admire them for that, because we had so many people who did this for so long that they did this to their brains as well. But this new generation, what I worry about is that they're going to be so callous that um, that's going to hurt them as well. That's going to be hard on relationships. And what I see a lot of, I'll go back to this Black history thing. Okay, there's so many people who are so tired of the conversation that now when you try to put something good out there, when you're like, you know what, we're doing this event and it's going to be unifying and positive and we're going to focus on brotherhood, not victimhood, people are just like, I don't want to hear it. And I think that no matter what, it's still part of the plan to divide us.
Hmm. Yeah. Um, like I'm thinking of like
Yep.
demoralization specifically. I
Yes.
think sometimes people get this word confused because like sometimes it means being like, like fatigued and not wanting to go on in that kind of sense, but it also means like you can't even like process true information anymore. And
Yes.
so like what you're describing, that's certainly like I think part of it is like people are just like so checked out and like exhausted, but also don't even want to engage in like the true things or the good things, or it does take work to kind of recover from what we've like, what's happened. I mean, this hasn't happened overnight, and getting out of it isn't going to happen overnight. That's why like moms groups, like Moms for America, Moms for Liberty, like these are so amazing
Right.
because like that's the work that needs to be done. And it doesn't happen when you're apathetic and, kind of like throwing your hands up.
Right. And that's exactly where I kind of want to go is how, as a professional, how do you suggest that we heal? One thing I want to know is how do my parents who have kids who are struggling find good therapists and avoid the pitfalls of, like, what questions can they ask? What can they do? Do you even think therapy is the right thing to do? I tend to think try your best to fix it with your family first. There's a lot of people who are like, oh, this is going on in school, I'm going to pull my kids out and homeschool. And I think, like, what are real solutions that they, and how can we, in your opinion, begin to fix society?
Yeah. So in terms of parents looking for like therapists and things like that, and in terms of like the appropriateness of therapy. So, like use your best judgment, like your parental judgment. Sometimes it does cross the line where you need professional help. That's okay. And I also like don't want parents to like freak out because of the situation of, in counseling and mental health to feel like there are no options because there are options. There are, I think, like a million clinicians in this country. So, there is a proportion that are going to be okay. But unfortunately, you're going to have to like sift through things a little bit more, and that's going to be really frustrating. One resource I can recommend, especially like if it specifically has to do with gender dysphoria or issues in that kind of realm, is I'm not sure if you're familiar with her, but Stephanie Wynn, I believe that she does consulting and things like that. So that could be a resource for parents. Even try like Googling non-woke therapy or like things like that, and you might find a directory that can help you, find ideology-free therapy. Use your judgment. Like if you look at somebody's profile, like their advertisement, and just like smacks you in the face with woke, don't do that. Definitely like be discerning in terms of like some of this more slippery language, like transformation, which could be a good thing. People go to therapy to try to get better and transform. I think like looking for therapists who seem down to earth, not like as minimally ideological as possible, and seem like they're not trying to do like these grand transformative things, that seem like maybe a little bit more oriented to certain modalities. For example, cognitive behavioral therapy. That would be a good option for a lot of people, especially for depression or anxiety, things like that. But I certainly want people to feel comfortable seeing a therapist. Like I don't want to discourage people from doing that, even though I will be the first to admit that the state of the profession is quite serious and, needs repairing and that there's a lot of harm going on. Also, like in terms of school, ask questions, like see if your kid is, perhaps seeing a school therapist, push for things like consent, be active and involved and like don't take it for granted that they would tell you.
Mhm.
Um, Obviously like being mindful of kind of like the personality and like the mood changes of your kid. If things start like sticking out to you, like just pay attention, things like that. Um, but yeah, I'm trying to think of like anything else on that front. And in terms of like healing the country, I mean that's challenging, but I mean, like the apathy thing, like check with yourself because like a lot of people very much are feeling apathetic, exhausted. So when that happens, like find routines, find ways of kind of, coping with like the onslaught of information, all of the stress, all of the setbacks, and just like kind of keep going, connect with people. I think that's really important. Um, and I think like the foundational thing when it comes down to it is that we need like I mean, just like a grounding in reality, and not like a hard smack in the face and like that kind of sense, but just like like a courageous standing in reality and like a very tangible, quite humble, frankly, kind of way. I think getting that both like, especially like intellectually, but also like spiritually, emotionally, things like that, that would go a long way because like all of that kind of underlies, I think, like these interpersonal challenges, the apathy, the overwhelm, things like that.
Wonderful. I just want to ask you one more thing, and I probably should have asked it somewhere else, but what do people think social and emotional learning is versus what is social and emotional learning?
Yeah, absolutely. So, social emotional learning is usually marketed, I mean, precisely as the name suggests. It's usually phrased in a way that makes it seem like, well, social emotional learning is just something that happens naturally. So, like, think of like how you learn to share, how you learn to interact with other people, how you learn to manage your emotions. Like, it's presented in this way as though, like, yeah, of course, that has always gone on as humans like grow and develop. And so it's presented as, well, it's already happening, so let's formalize it and do it in the schools. However, it's like mostly a way of like doing more of this really specific kind of neo-Marxist, cultural Marxist brainwashing. So for example, like being able to share. That could seem normal, okay? But then like it'll also be like, okay, well, maybe don't believe in private property or, kind of having a more collectivist mindset that's like not so individualist. Same with like emotional management. Like, yeah, emotional management is like a really important thing, but in the context of like social emotional learning specifically, it's usually like taking your brainwashing well, being able to persevere through your activism, like these kinds of things. So it's very like pernicious in that kind of way because like of course these are things that you want to develop in children. And also in terms of like whose responsibility it is because like I didn't have social emotional learning as a kid, but we like kind of do that anyway, like at home, in schools, just like normal interactions and things like that. So whether or not you need like formalized curriculum and like programs and stuff like that is hugely questionable.
Yeah, I I have seen some things that say that we have a range of humanity. I'll have to send that to you, but a range of humanity, and you're more human if you follow these values, which tend to go with the SDGs,
Oh,
versus, yeah,
yeah.
versus less human if you are taught you're not joking, your parents' old ideas, traditions, beliefs, and cultures.
That's so Maoist. Wow. Yeah, and
Holy
like that's
cow.
like the sustainable development goals. Like this is very much in the realm of what I would call the sustainable and inclusive religion, which is very like social emotional learning is kind of like brainwashing into this very like collectivist, inclusive, pseudo-inclusive kind of religion that's like within the framework of the United Nations. And it's why like I can't get into it in this context, but like it's why there's like a little bit of a history at the Fetzer Institute in terms of like its
Right.
frankly occult
Absolutely.
nature, like it's a theosophist kind of thing, which coincides with what I would consider to be the kind of like the religious cult nature of the United Nations. I know that's kind of like an extreme thing to kind of end on, but there are resources on newdiscourses.com that I think are worth people listening to.
Agreed. In fact, on New Discourses, for people who feel like this was heavy, his longer talks are heavy, but he does have bullets. And those are just like between 5 and 10 minutes of just barely getting your feet wet. It's very useful. Katie, thank you. This has been so illuminating, and I just appreciate whenever I get to meet people who are just committed, and especially because you went through it. Like, because I know for me, if I would have been in that counseling school and they would have started this, I know what I would have done. I would have said, yeah, this is Marxism on a platter. No, I'm out. But to go through it is important. So it's not dead by a long shot. I feel like we got ourselves a reprieve because things could have went much, much worse. And so we got ourselves a reprieve, and we have people who are going to try to do the right thing. But you cannot do the right thing if you are not informed. You can't, because it is so insidious. It is
Mhm.
just it is it's like a cobra. And so I'm so grateful that there are people like you who are willing to stand up and tell the truth. And I wish you the best. And I'm
Absolutely. Thank you so much for having me.
yes, you're delightful. So have a great day.
Thank you, you too.
Bye-bye.